All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our presentation titled Trailblazers of Black Theatre plus Q&A with the author Stephen Bourne. For this event, we'll be taking questions at the end. So we're going to hear from Stephen Bourne for roughly about an hour or so, and then we'll take questions after Mr. Bourne has finished speaking. So you can chat to each other if you so desire, but we'll be taking questions after the presentation is over using the chat function or sometimes the Q&A if you have a Q&A function on your particular machine. This event is brought to you by the Sarah Parker Remond Centre based at University College London and Black History Walks. Previous lectures that have been hosted by Black History Walks and the Sarah Parker Remond Centre have been recorded, and you can find them on this YouTube channel. So there's a whole bunch of lectures we've done the last 6 months or so, from sterilization of Black women without their consent to the groundbreaking book Black Teacher by Beryl Gilroy, to Kenyan uprisings with Njambi McGrath, the author, to how a guy called Harry Cumberbatch used mental health and history to address the issues of unfair treatment in the mental health system in the Tower Hamlets area. So there's a whole bunch of diverse and eclectic topics you can access on this website, this YouTube channel, I should say, including this lecture. So this lecture is going to be recorded and it will be placed on this website in about maybe a week's time. So if you want to see this event that you're watching now, you want to replay or review it, you can watch it on this website in possibly about a week's time. So Black History Walks organizes walks, talks, and films, and bus tours and river cruises on London's Black history each month of the year for the last 15 years. Bottom right-hand corner, you can see a luxury, beautiful red cinema, and that's where we have our film program. It's called the African Odysseys program. And of course, there's a link between the theatre and film, in that actors who are on stage often graduate to making movies. But you find that the images you're seeing here, the posters you see here for these films, these are not posters you'd normally see in the mainstream cinema houses. So if you go to Odeon or Picture House or Cineworld, these kind of films are absent for the most part. But we show them once a month, plus a Q&A, at the BFI South Bank for the last 15 years, and it's titled the African Odysseys program. So if you Google that name, you can see what's coming up. But also, if you go to the BFI website, bfi.org.uk, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 films coming up. In particular, well, of particular interest, you got a free screening of Once Upon a Time When We Were Coloured, which is aimed at elderly people, people over 65, but anyone can come to it. So if you're over 65, it's free. If you're under 65, I think it's like £6.50, and that's going to take place, well, it's going to take place on the 29th of November. But other than that, we have a number of films looking at the Black British civil rights legend that is Darcus Howe. So Darcus Howe, apart from being the Black Panthers, apart from being a major part of the Black People's Day of Action back in 1981, he was also a TV personality. So we're going to be showing some of his films, plus a Q&A, plus interviews with his colleagues and compatriots at the BFI in November. So that's a quite unusual, rare event. You can get tickets from now, but I expect that one to be sold out. And I'm talking about in the big NFT1 cinema. But that is some really interesting stuff we're going to be showing. Darcus Howe's old films, plus a Q&A with his colleagues. Now, I mentioned that we do walks, talks, films, bus tours, and river cruises. That's just a picture of some people doing a walk. And one of our walks, the Notting Hill walk, was turned into a GCSE exam textbook with Pearson Edexcel. So we took our Notting Hill Black History walk and we extracted information from that walk and made it into a GCSE exam textbook, never been done before. You can actually buy this book now and use it if you're a teacher in secondary schools, or if you're just interested in some Black British civil rights history, you can also buy it for yourself because it's full of resources and unusual documentation, etc. Here's an example. So for the first time ever, you can study the Mangrove 9 at GCSE. So you got images there, text, newspaper articles, etc., interviews with some of the people who are involved in the Mangrove 9, and that whole topic of Black British civil rights, Notting Hill, Frank Rich, and the Mangrove is now able to be studied at GCSE level. Apart from that, you've got a whole bunch of events coming up, which you can access for free or for £6 or for, £10, whatever, online and physical. So you can take your pick from the coming events there. You got a special online screening of a film called Errol Barra, Freedom Fighter, who is a World War II hero, then goes back to Barbados, becomes leader of Barbados, and institutes free healthcare for education. So an amazing true story, which will be shown online 26th September. This Sunday coming up. And then, of course, you got 20th September, I Fought the Law and I Won, a Black Judge Speaks. So this is Judge Peter Herbert, who actually sued the judiciary for racism, for unfair treatment due to his color or his race. And he actually won. He sort of kind of won his case, in effect, more or less. So he's going to speak about that. And that has about 1,400 people logged on for it so far. So if you want to get a ticket to that, make sure you kind of do it in the next couple of days, because that's going to be full for sure. Then, of course, you got the River Cruise coming up shortly. That's also almost full. November the 3rd and 4th, again, we're having other events to do with Darcus House. So we have Leila Hassan Howe, who is a legend in her own right, speaking about her life in the Black Power movement. And then we have her speaking about her partner, Darcus Howe. So these are free events online, again, quite unusual, quite unique, etc. And these are paralleled with the films at the BFI. So there's a bunch of stuff you can choose from. Just go to the website, blackhistorywalk.co.uk, and take your pick. So the Sarah Parker Remond Centre comes out of student activism. So students back in 2019, this is before 2020, before George Floyd, were out there on the streets, in the halls, demonstrating, campaigning for change in the curriculum, change in the staff, etc. And they were heard and listened to, which has led to the establishment of the Sarah Parker Remond Centre for the study of racism and racialization. So it's a very interesting setup. The head of the organization is a guy called Professor Paul Gilroy, and with his team of academics, they're doing a whole bunch of research and events to do with empire, history, race, colonization, etc. So it's quite an interesting group they have there, and they do lots of online lectures and podcasts, like what you can see there. And here's a list of some of their old stuff. So if you go to their website, you can access all of this previous content with various academics and experts to do with eugenics, history, colonization, race. It's a very valuable resource. And I should mention briefly, we have a Black History Theatre Walk. So if you're interested in Black history and theatre, you can come on our walk, which is taking place at, 9 o'clock this Saturday morning. So there's a few tickets left, but we'll be exploring, we'll be showing you where African, Caribbean actors, producers, directors, comedians performed and did their thing in the West End. But we are here to look at Black history and theatre in the distant past, and I suppose more recent past too. And to speak to us, we have a real expert, a guy called Stephen Bourne, who's written about 25 different books when it comes to history. So the guy is a bit of a legend. And if you look at the first paragraph there, he's been on the scene since 1991. 91, so he's not new. He's been around for quite a long time. And he was a founder member of BASA, the Black and Asian Studies Association, which is, a really under-recognized group when it comes to the promotion and sustenance of Black history. They did a massive amount of work back in the 90s and 2000s. They went defunct a couple of years ago, but their legacy is everywhere, including with Mr. Bourne's work. So Mr. Bourne has a new book out called Deep Are the Roots, which is on the left-hand side there. It's available now to pre-order, but it officially is launched, I think, on the 7th of October. So Stephen Tesla, but it's coming out shortly. And this book is a revolutionary, groundbreaking, very interesting book. And Mr. Bourne is going to tell us all, or not all, but about some of the good stuff that's in there. So without further ado, the next voice you're going to hear is the voice of Mr. Stephen Bourne. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for this kind invitation. It's a bit scary for me because, first of all, the book, as you say, isn't published yet. It's not published until 2 more weeks. We've got 2 more weeks, 7th of October. And So I would assume that nobody that has kindly joined us this evening has read it. Only I've read it and my publisher, but there you are. But I'll do my best to highlight some of the stories in the book to give you a flavour of what you will find when you hopefully either buy the book for yourself, or, as I always say to people, I always encourage them to get their local library, public library or university library if they're students, to order it for their library, because we need to support our libraries. It is available to pre-order on Amazon, but again, I do try to encourage people to buy the book in bookshops to keep our bookshops surviving. Now, as Tony said, I have been writing Black British history books for 30 years. So October next month, October 2021, will mark the 30th anniversary of the publication of my first Black British history book, which was a booklet that was published in 1991 about my adopted aunt Esther, who was a Black Londoner born before the First World War. And what I learned from doing this particular book, Aunt Esther's story, was the importance of first-hand testimony. So first-hand testimony is paramount for me. It's what drives me to write Black British histories, to try and meet the people, interview some of the people that created the history, as opposed to the academic route, which I am not engaged with, which is using words ending in ology. I don't use words ending in ology. If any of you out there are from an academic background, I appreciate that way of learning history, writing about history, but it's not my way. So in the 30 years that I've been doing this work, I am probably best known, this is the plug, you'll forgive me, best known for Black Poppies, which was a book that I had published in 2014 to coincide with the centenary of World War I. So this is Black Poppies, Britain's Black Community and the Great War. So I expanded the story to include not just Black servicemen in the First World War on the British side, but also the wider Black community, because that's where my heart lies. And so coming to Black theatre, again, I might find it a bit strange to do this talk, because I've never, in 30 years, I have never been asked to give a talk about Black theatre in Britain. I was interviewed for a documentary about the subject called Margins to Mainstream about 10 years ago. I've contributed to one or two conferences, but that's about it. I discovered early on that through the first-hand testimony approach that I take, I managed in the 1980s and 90s to meet some of the amazing trailblazers, as I call them, the pioneers. And this is Carmen Monroe, who some of you may have heard of. And this is a signed photograph that she gave me, presented to me in her dressing room in 1987, when she was appearing in London's West End in James Baldwin's The Amen Corner, a wonderful, wonderful production that she starred in. And that's what I've been doing, is collecting interviews, collecting stories, collecting photographs, memorabilia, but most importantly, making friends with a lot of these people that I'd encountered and met through time. One that I wasn't able to meet because he died tragically in 1988 was the great Errol John, a Trinidadian actor who became a playwright and one of the very first, not the first, but one of the early Caribbean, West Indian playwrights at the Royal Court, with his famous production of Moon on a Rainbow Shawl in 1958. So that's covered in the book. But one of my early opportunities was to do some research at the Theatre Museum. About 20 years ago, the Theatre Museum was based in Covent Garden, and I managed to access a little tiny bit of funding from the Society for West End Theatre to go to the Theatre Museum, which they embraced, and to work with Susan Croft, who was one of the people that worked in the Theatre Museum, and to catalogue their Black and Asian archive. And then after doing this for about a year, Susan published through the Theatre Museum, this was in 2003, so this is a long time ago, the Black and Asian performance at the Theatre Museum, a user's guide. So it was edited and written by Susan, and with Stephen Bourne and Dr. Alda Terrasciano. I probably pronounced that really badly. I saw your name in the list, Alda, so forgive me. I'm not very good at pronouncing names. But what Alda and I did at the end of the book, which is important for the new book, I did key Black and Asian productions database from 1825 to 1975. Alda picked up the database of 1975 to 2000, whenever we had it published, 2000. So that was sold by the Theatre Museum 20 odd years, nearly 20 odd years ago. I don't know whether it's available now, but it started me on the road to doing more in-depth research, doing more interviews, and approaching publishers. Yes, this is where it gets a bit, to do a book. I wanted to do this book, Deep Are the Roots, 20 years ago. Every single publisher in this country that I went to, and I found my list when I was doing, writing this book last year under lockdown. I shouldn't show the names of the publishers. I might need them in the future. So in 2010, I felt that I had enough information and research to do this book, Deep Are the Roots. I've got a list here that I scribbled down in 2010 of 11 publishers. Not interested, not interested, not interested, not interested, didn't reply, not interested. One publisher did reply, a young, very enthusiastic editor at a well-known theatre publishing house, who shall remain nameless. He said, yes, I want to commission it. I'm new here. This is a great idea. Let's publish it. This would have been in 2010. So this is what, 11 years ago. And he came back to me in great embarrassment and said that the editorial board said no. I was so despondent and so upset by those rejections. I'd had other rejections for other Black British history books, but this was particularly painful, as I knew enough to do this book that I wanted to do, that I put the proposal away. I couldn't look at it again. I couldn't bother with, and some of the publishers would say to me things like, Black people don't buy books. There's no market for Black interest books. This was from the early part of the, what was it, 20 years ago to 2010. And so I put the proposal away, and then I turned a corner with Black Poppies. The History Press have been supportive. I've done several books with them. And then last year, following the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, my editor at the History Press said, have you got any ideas for more Black British history books? Because, you know, we're keen to keep working with you. And so I came up with Deep Are the Roots, Trailblazers Who Changed Black British Theatre. I didn't have to do much with the proposal, the original proposal, because it was still concentrated on a specific timeline, which was 1825 to 1975, 150 years. So I stopped in 1975. And they commissioned it, and now the book's coming out in 2 weeks' time. It's called Being Persistent and Believing in What You're Doing. When I discussed the proposal with my editor at the History Press, Simon, I said to him, I'm tired of writing books and being objective. When I was younger, I was always told you have to write objectively. You cannot put yourself in the story. You cannot write from personal anecdotes. You have to be objective. You have to be academic. And I thought to myself, I'm getting too old for all this ridiculous restrictions that are put on us when we write history books. Let me put myself in the story. Let me make this book part autobiographical as well as historical. And that's what I've done. So when you read chapters about Carmen Monroe or many others, Pearl Connor, I can't think of the names, but if I had some personal connection to them, I'm there. I'm telling you my story and how I found them and what they told me and what they shared with me. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to do, which has never been done as far as I'm aware, is you can turn away if you're easily offended. This is the horrible portrayal of Othello, Shakespeare's Othello, by Laurence Olivier. And I didn't see the National Theatre production in the 60s. I did see the film version for the first time in 1983. Once seen, never forgotten. It's awful. But I wanted to do one of the early chapters before I got into the subject in a bigger way. I wanted to do a critique because no one had really critiqued Laurence Olivier's Othello and how it impacted on Black actors, if you like. I found about 9 biographies of Laurence Olivier, all by white middle-class men. None of them quoted a Black actor or a Black commentator on Olivier's Othello. So I dug deep and found quotes, which I've used in that chapter. And I want to read Cy Grant. Some of you may be aware of the wonderful Cy Grant, who I knew, born in Guyana, actor on television, on stage and film. He was probably the most critical of the Black British actors who saw Olivier's Othello in the 1960s. Cy Grant had played the role at the Phoenix Theatre in Leicester in 1965. Later in his memoir, Blackness and the Dreaming Soul, he didn't hold back. This is what he said. Cy Grant said, "To say that I did not like Olivier's portrayal of Othello would be an understatement. If Orson Welles at the St. James's Theatre a decade earlier made him into a gorilla, Olivier's was a white man's ignoble caricature of a Moor. How could such a great actor and warm human being be so misguided? I had watched the production from the gods at the Old Vic. It was the only seat I could get. I dread to think what my reaction would have been if I had been sitting in the stalls to observe it in close-up. I was, of course, to have all my fears confirmed when I later saw the screen version, which was made in 1965. I hated his portrayal of Shakespeare's noble Moor." So there's a whole chapter about this, which ends on Paul Robeson Jr.'s comment about his father and Olivier's Othello, because Paul Robeson obviously played the part twice, in Britain, once in America. Paul Robeson Jr. said that Dad always refused to be quoted on Olivier's performance as Othello, but I can say this, it was absurd. What Olivier did was to hang around the Caribbean community in London and imitate their ways. Only somebody with a huge cultural insensitivity would figure, well, the guy's Black, so I'll watch the Blacks around here and then impose that on a Shakespearean role. That reflects a man who is narrow-minded and racist. So it's quite strong words, but it's time that these things were brought out into the open. So let's go back to the beginning. Although the book begins in 1875 with the great Ira Aldridge, the Shakespearean, the Black African-American, I should say, African-American Shakespearean of the Victorian era, I actually have found and put it in my database, because I've completely revised and overhauled the database that I did for the Theatre Museum and added to it. In the late 1700s, there is a reference in a book that I found to a Black actress playing Shakespeare's Juliet, and John Gay's Polly in the Beggar's Opera in Lancashire in I think it's the 1780s or something. And that's all we know. We don't know her name. She's invisible, but there is a record, as you will read in the book, of this breakthrough performance. And it does beg the question, how many others before Ira Aldridge in 1825 were acting Shakespearean roles? I mean, we will probably never know, but you never know. If you keep an open mind, I've always said this to people, if you keep an open mind, you'll never know what you will uncover. So Ira Aldridge was the famous and celebrated African-American Shakespearean actor of the Victorian era. He came to this country in 1825, made his debut at the Royal Coburg Theatre, which is now known as the Old Vic, where he is now honoured. I think it's this portrait that is on the wall there. I attended the unveiling ceremony some years ago. And Ira died in 1867 in Poland, because he was also very popular abroad in Europe and other countries. Never in America. He was never given an opportunity to do Shakespeare in America, but he played a range of stage parts, not just Shakespeare, and not just Shakespeare's Othello. He played Richard III, I mean, many other, King Lear, of course, and many other performances. And there is a link between him and Paul Robeson. They say that between Ira Aldridge, who died in 1867, and Paul Robeson, who was in London doing Othello in 1930, there were no other black Othellos, but I'll come back to that in a moment. But Ira Aldridge did have a daughter, Amanda Ira Aldridge, who fascinates me. She was a trained classical singer, born in 1866. She didn't know her father. She was a baby when he died the following year, but she was British born and trained as a classical singer, and then in her latter years became a voice teacher, a very well-known and respected voice coach. So Paul Robeson, another African-American expatriate like Ira Aldridge before him, when he came to Britain in the 1920s, he was encouraged to play Shakespeare's Othello, and which he did finally in 1930 at the Savoy Theatre with Peggy Ashcroft as Desdemona. And he was advised to go to Amanda Ira Aldridge, the daughter of Ira Aldridge, for voice and diction lessons, which he appreciated, and he absolutely adored her. She died in 1956, only a couple of years ago. I found her unmarked grave in Streatham Cemetery, which was rather sad. But I mentioned that in most sources claim that between Ira Aldridge and Paul Robeson, there were no other black actors playing Othello in Britain. That's not true. There was Morgan Smith, who I haven't really dealt with in this new book because there was a recent biography of Morgan, which I've acknowledged. But there was also Paul Molyneaux, who intrigued me because there was hardly any information about him. But with the magic of the internet, I dug a bit deeper and found that Paul Molyneaux did indeed play Othello and Richard III at Kilburn Town Hall in 1883. And with a lot of imagination and knowing how to use the internet, I discovered that he had a British wife, a mixed race daughter. I found his descendants, one living in Wales, one living in Devon. They were absolutely thrilled when I approached them. They knew about him. Sadly, no photographs exist of Paul, but if you want to find out more about Paul and his wonderful family, his descendants, please do pay special attention to that chapter, because I've called it Paul Molyneaux, the forgotten Othello, because he doesn't really get acknowledged, because he didn't make the impact of Ira Aldridge or Paul Robeson, but he is significant to this story. I'm going to move on now to a very dear friend of mine. She passed away in 1998, and this was Pauline Henriquez. Pauline came from a middle-class Jamaican family. She was a very young child when she arrived here with her mother and father and her brothers and sisters in 1919. I met her for the first time in 1989, and She had long since given up the stage, long since given up acting. In fact, she spent the latter half of her life as a campaigner for unmarried mothers, did some groundbreaking work with the Book Advisory Service in the 1960s. So she was intrigued when I approached her in retirement. She was retired. She was living in Brighton at the time, to talk about her acting career. No one's asked me anything about my acting career. So she told me that when she was growing up in London, in North London, the family settled in St John's Wood. She went to the theatre regularly with her brothers and sisters, and they then acted out plays at home. In spite of the lack of opportunities for a young Black British actress at that time, Pauline dreamed of becoming a professional actress. Now, I put Pauline into the first Black drama students chapter. So I've gone back in time and uncovered some of the first pioneering Black drama students. So in 1932, with her parents' support, Pauline joined a drama course at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. She said, this is what she told me: I started going to the theatre when I was 7. I lost my Jamaican accent rather quickly. So when I went to drama school, I had an English accent, which was perfect for the classic roles. This is in the early 1930s. The course lasted for 1 year and I appeared in many school productions, but I had to play my parts in whiteface, including Lady Bracknell and Lady Macbeth. But I went along with it because I was very anxious to learn my craft and to be taken seriously as a dramatic actress. However, after leaving drama school, I finished up playing comic black maids in American plays, which had been imported to Britain, and one line, "Yes'm, Isa come in," which I learned to express about 18 different ways. Now, in the 1940s, or rather more specifically 1945, sticking with this chapter about Black drama students, the charismatic Jamaican folklorist and poet Louise Bennett, popularly known as Miss Lou, was awarded a British Council scholarship to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, commonly or popularly known as RADA, situated in Bloomsbury in central London. In 1945, RADA was short of money. Wartime London had been a very dangerous place to be and student numbers had dropped. After the war, it was a truly vibrant place. It was in this climate that Louise Bennett successfully applied for a place at RADA. However, there was a misunderstanding. She had been accepted as a student with a scholarship and had a letter from the British Council to prove it, but no one had informed RADA. Though the war was nearly over, she risked her life by traveling across the Atlantic on a ship protected by wartime convoys. And on her arrival at RADA, Louise Bennett was asked to audition. She agreed, and for diction, she presented an excerpt from George Bernard Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra. She then dazzled the assessors by performing all the characters in a courthouse scene, as she had enjoyed seeing in Jamaica. Speaking in Jamaican dialect, Bennett played the judge, the policeman, and a character called Matilda Slackness. The assessors at RADA were about to award Bennett a scholarship when she explained that she had already been given one in Jamaica. So the audition had been unnecessary, but the assessors had been entertained and impressed by her remarkable talent. At RADA, Bennett attended classes in theatre history, dramatic structure, acting, voice and speech, movement, mime, but she refused to lose her Jamaican accent and identity. She said, "I just let them know that I didn't come to lose any of the cultural things that I had acquired." Bennett acted in plays by several European dramatists, including Shakespeare, and in a RADA production of Romeo and Juliet, she was highly commended for playing the nurse in Jamaican Creole. Bennett was also considered an outstanding student in mime. After completing her RADA course, Louise Bennett decided not to pursue a career as an actress in Britain. There were few opportunities anyway. Instead, she returned home to Jamaica and successfully applied for another British Council scholarship that enabled her to continue her passion for collecting folklore from Jamaica and other Caribbean islands. Almost single-handedly, Louise Bennett saved Jamaican folklore from extinction. Miss Lou gave Jamaicans a pride in their language and culture, as well as their future. The Jamaican dub poet and activist Linton Kwesi Johnson said, "She gave my generation of writers the confidence to use our ordinary, everyday Jamaican speech as a legitimate vehicle for poetic discourse. What Miss Lou's poetry does is to offer a mirror to Jamaican people in which Jamaicans can see themselves in all their various manifestations, with all their strengths and their weaknesses." And there are other stories of Black drama students, including my dear friend Annie Domingo, when she went to the Rose Bruford School of Drama in the late 1960s. Moving on, going back to Pauline, who I mentioned went to drama school, she did eventually have a career of sorts, mainly broadcasting for the BBC and Caribbean Voices, the series that Una Marson created for the BBC in the 1940s. And she also had an opportunity. That photograph, she told me, was her spotlight photograph in the directory. And she was seen, that photograph was seen by Kenneth Tynan, a well-known theatre critic, and he cast her as Amelia in Shakespeare's Othello. That had never been done before, very rarely since, as far as I can find out. And that was an Arts Council tour of Othello in 1950. And Pauline told me that once she'd spoken Shakespeare's lines on the stage, she couldn't function as an actress again. Because going back to playing American maids in American plays that were imported just wasn't fulfilling, which is why she turned her sights to social work. But also in that production was a wonderful, wonderful African-American expatriate actor called Gordon Heath, who came here in 1947 in a play called Deep Are the Roots. So nothing's original. I pinched the title from Gordon's play, but it was a very important, groundbreaking New York Broadway production in 1945 about a returning African-American GI to the Deep South, to his family in the Deep South, and the big house with the white Southerners and the conflict he comes. But that play was so successful on Broadway that they brought it to London in 1947, and he remained in the cast as the lead actor. But he never went back to America. He came with his partner, Lee Payant, his lover, his American partner. Gay relationships, homosexuality was still a criminal offence in Britain. So when Deep Are the Roots closed, Lee and Gordon moved to Paris, where a lot of African-American expatriates made their home, like James Baldwin. I'm sure many of you have heard of James Baldwin. And they opened a famous nightclub called Le Bee, which Gordon was also a well-known folk singer. But so the nightclub, they ran for almost 2 decades until Lee died in the 1970s. But Gordon would come back to Britain. He did Othello Arts Council tour in 1950, but he also did, some of you may be aware of the 1954 animation film Animal Farm, based on George Orwell's novel. It's Gordon that does the narration. But he came back to Britain to do stage work, television work, and I never got to meet him. I did get to talk to him on the phone just before he passed away in 1991, but I want to read some extracts from Gordon's chapter in the book. I did interview his friend Leslie Schenck, who saw some of Gordon Heath's best theatre work, mainly in France, both as an actor and director. He was also a director. Leslie told me that, like Olivier, Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, and Marlon Brando, Gordon had such presence that others vanished beside him. All the more interesting to note the great care with which he created his roles. The actors Gordon directed were not Olivier's or Brando's for the most part, yet Gordon's analytical faculties permitted them to get inside their roles as they never would have been able to on their own. As great an actor as he was, on the level of Olivier, I would say he was an even greater director. I want to also quote Gordon Heath himself when he was interviewed in a British theatre magazine called Theatre World in September 1947. It's called On Being a Negro Actor. Negro was obviously the term that was used then, so I'm using it in its historical context. Gordon said, "I try not to think of myself as a Negro actor. When considering a part, I ask myself, am I temperamentally suited to play it? And if I think I am, that is all that matters. I played Death in Death Takes a Holiday and Professor Higgins in Pygmalion. He also played Hamlet, although he doesn't mention it here. I felt that I understood them and could project them effectively on the stage, so I played them. It is possible to cast Negroes for parts without calling any particular attention to their colour. The audience accepts them as they accepted Canada Lee playing a white part, Bosola, in Elizabeth Bergner's Broadway production of John Webster's Jacobean tragedy, The Duchess of Malfi. So in 1947 in Britain, Gordon, an expatriate, is saying this in a British magazine, that the world should be a black actor's oyster. They should be allowed to play all sorts of parts. I'll just end on another quote at the end of the chapter on Gordon by Leslie Schenck. I asked Leslie Schenck whether had Gordon stayed in America, he would have had the fame that Sidney Poitier had in Hollywood films. Leslie replied, Gordon would not have enjoyed that kind of international fame and popularity. He preferred to remain a free agent. He loved the theatre, and a great cross he had to bear was that there was not enough roles for him to play. But he didn't make this a crutch, as some people do. Not at all. He just got on with his life and made the best of things. He didn't let it destroy him. Very inspiring figure. I now want to sort of turn my attention to someone that I did befriend and loved very dearly, is Pearl Connor-Mogotsi. Pearl Connor was from Trinidad, as was her first husband, Edric, great actor and singer, folk singer, very much in the tradition of Louise Bennett. He would collect Trinidadian folk songs, brought them to London in 1944 to sing on the BBC. He broadened out to become an actor and married Pearl in London in 1948. They'd met in Trinidad. He sadly died in 1968. I met Pearl the same year that I met Pauline in 1989. I talk about that in the book. And Pearl is just an extraordinary figure in the world of British theatre and performing arts. But just to mention briefly that I do go into great detail about Edric Connor's story, but just to mention that he did play Gower in Pericles at Stratford upon Avon in 1958, thus becoming the first black actor to be cast in a Shakespearean role at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. Found some wonderful images of him in that role. The role was intended for Paul Robeson, who was sadly unable to come to Britain because of his passport had been withdrawn. Again, there's a whole chapter about Paul Robeson that goes into that in great detail. But I want to talk about some of the achievements, some of the remarkable things that Edric and particularly Pearl did. In 1956, Edric and Pearl founded the Edric Connor Agency, which later became known as the Afro-Asian Caribbean Agency. And for the next 20 years, the agency represented artists, writers, and performers from the Caribbean, Malaysia, India, and Africa. Pearl told me that Edric was looked upon as a father figure in Britain's black community. So when performing artists came from the Caribbean, they came straight to our London home. In those days, there were very few places where they could meet. So she would feed people, give them a bed for the night or a mattress on the living room floor, wherever. And this is how the Black African Caribbean artistic community, particularly in the performing arts, evolved. So the agency came about because they were not getting representation by British actors' agents. Edric and Pearl decided to do something for them, and they became the first agency to represent them. Pearl said she was full of beans and would push them like mad, but producers kept inviting black stars and actors over from America. She said, this is a quote from Pearl, at the Royal Court in 1958, they brought over Vinette Carroll and Earl Hyman for Errol John's Moon on a Rainbow Shawl. It was set in Trinidad, but they brought over Americans. And then Earl Hyman came back the following year for A Raisin in the Sun, the London production of Lorraine Hansberry's famous play. This happened because they had a certain celebrity status which gave them the edge on Britain's black performers. And Americans were appreciated more in Britain. They were also considered better actors, which was unfair. We had no media attention, no press coverage, no general promotion. In Britain, our black actors had to make it on pure merit and friends. We even fought with equity to give more chances to black actors because they kept bringing over the Americans. We had a very difficult time convincing casting directors that our black actors could act. We were always second-rate citizens, so it was very difficult to break through. So eventually, in an attempt to create new acting opportunities for those they represented and to support newcomers, in 1961, Edric and Pearl founded the Negro Theatre Workshop. It was launched at London's Lyric Theatre with a play called A Wreath for Domo, and Edric Connor led a class that also included Earl Cameron, Lloyd Record, and Evelyn Dove. The workshop's most active period was 1964 to 67. It is perhaps best known for its productions of Wole Soyinka's The Road at Theatre Royal Stratford, which was part of the 1965 Commonwealth Arts Festival, and The Dark Disciples, described as a blues version of the St. Luke Passion. With Pearl as its driving force, the workshop was an ensemble of professional and amateur actors, directors and writers performing original works in community centres, town halls, churches and cathedrals up and down the country. And it also represented Britain at the First World Festival of Negro Arts in Dakar, Senegal. It was an ambitious project that hoped to maintain continuous productions of dramas, reviews and musicals, and in doing so, give black actors experience and black writers a chance to see their work performed. But sadly, they could not ever get the funding together. No one would fund them to have a permanent base. That would not happen for any black theatre company until a few years later. That I talk about in another chapter in the book called Black Theatre Companies. I deal with one chapter about the early black theatre companies, and then later the more contemporary black theatre companies from the late 60s and early 70s, including Frank Cousins' Dark and Light Theatre. Just to go back to Pearl, in 1991, when I interviewed the Jamaican actor and director Lloyd Record, I asked him about Edric and Pearl and what they had achieved. His face immediately lit up. He told me that Edric and Pearl were constantly campaigning on behalf of us black artists. Hold on just a sec. I can't do this without the photograph. So there's the signed by Pearl. Edric and Pearl were constantly campaigning on behalf of us black artists. They were the salt of the earth, especially Pearl, who worked solidly, like all small agents, for the people she represented. But of course, it was all small agents who represent young artists. She brought them up from nothing, only to find that after getting their first or second big break, they left her and took on the bigger or more powerful agents to represent them. It's very sad. It had nothing to do with colour. It's a cruel business. We all know it's a cruel business. And then Pearl, finally, at the end of their chapter, I have her interview that I did with her. She said that she believed that Edric had a sense of his destiny, but he died much too young. As I said, in 1968, he was only 53. He hadn't achieved everything he wanted to do. He moved into this country and took every opportunity he had here to make a lasting mark so that those people who came after him would know that it was possible. Possibilities was what he was about, that if you had the chance, you could take it and make good. In Britain, there is no record of the contribution we have made to the performing arts. Edric did good work, but it is lost in time and space. There is no memory in Britain for us. There is a hole in the ground and we fall into it. Pearl told me that. There is a hole in the ground and we fall into it. And in spite of the rejections I had for this book, the many rejections I had, I owed it to Pearl to honour their memory and to get this book done. I want to end on Alfred Fagon. Alfred Fagon, I don't have any photographs to show you, but there are many writers in the book as well. I've done a chapter about Mustafa Matura, Michael Abensets, and Alfred Fagon. Alfred Fagon is remembered by some, but not enough people. He needs to be better remembered. On his arrival from Jamaica in 1955, Alfred Fagon worked for British Rail in Nottingham. After a stint in the army, he spent time travelling while earning a living as a calypso singer. Settling in the St Paul's area of Bristol, he worked as a welder before pursuing an acting and writing career. That was in the 1960s. But in 1970, Alfred Fagon's role in Mustafa Matura's play Black Pieces brought him to London for his professional acting debut. But it was a turning point for Alfred because Matura broke new ground by encouraging his actors to use the dialect of the Caribbean islands, something, as I've already mentioned, that Louise Bennett was doing early on at RADA. As Roland Rees explained in his introduction to Fagon's plays, the language Fagon was being asked to speak amazed him. He had never before seen patois, an oral tradition written down on paper. This was a clarifying moment for him, and one which was to have far-reaching repercussions. It persuaded him that he could write plays with characters that could tell his stories, culled from his own experience, in a language that was natural to them. He was convinced that this would lead him to write plays entirely different in style and emotional content to Matura. Alfred knew that he had a very different voice, but the lesson he had learned, along with the rest of the cast of Black Pieces, they now knew that they did not have to try to be English anymore. Inspired by Matura's writing and the other Caribbean actors in Black Pieces, Fagon's first production as a dramatist was 11 Josephine House. A review in the Stage newspaper in 1972 praised Fagon's work. The play is brilliantly entertaining, well written and beautifully performed. One of the cast members, Oscar James, later reflected, it was about West Indians bringing their own culture and community here into England, into the English culture. There is unity in that life, whereas the whole English system was tearing them apart. It is about exile. Fagon played a crucial role in the development of a new kind of Black theatre in Britain. And in 1974, when he directed his stage play No Soldiers at the Metro Club off Westbourne Grove in London, he took his work into the heart of the Black community. His other plays at this time included The Death of a Black Man at the Hampstead Theatre, which was recently this year revived. And for television, he wrote and starred in BBC's Shakespeare Country in 1973 with Carmen Monroe in the cast, a semi-autobiographical drama in which he explored the difficulties faced by a struggling Black actor trying to make his way in a profession dominated by the language of William Shakespeare. Alfred Fagon continued acting and writing into the 1980s, but on the 29th of August, 1986, he suffered a heart attack, a fatal heart attack while jogging near his home. He was declared dead on his arrival at King's College Hospital, Denmark Hill, Lambeth. Afterwards, the police claimed that an officer had visited his home and could not find any contacts for him. However, it was later established that the officer had overlooked a great deal of information about him, including his diary with phone numbers, Equity Union card, passport, and a BBC script next to his bed. Consequently, it was 2 weeks before his family and friends were made aware that he had died and had been given a pauper's funeral. Roland Rees later said that the young police officer who searched Alfred's flat made assumptions that this man was a loner, a Black man who nobody would miss. In 1987, on the first anniversary of his death, a bronze bust of Fagon on a black marble pedestal was erected on the Ashley Road, Grosvenor Road triangle in the St Paul's area of Bristol. Fagon became the first Black person to be honoured with a statue in Bristol. On the 7th of June last year, 7th of June 2020, A statue of the slave trader Edward Colston was pulled down and thrown into the Bristol harbour during Black Lives Matter protests. This was sparked by the death of an African-American, George Floyd, while in the custody of Minneapolis police in the USA. Just 9 days later, after the toppling of the Edward Colston statue, the bust of Alfred Fagon was covered in bleach by vandals. There is a postscript to the book, which I'm not going to read from, but it is a tribute to the great Norman Beaton, who kind of bridges the period that I cover and the more modern period. Great, great actor, one of my favorite actors, still needs to be remembered much more than he is. When Channel 4 did their All Day Black programming I think it was last week, they repeated Desmond's, wow, at sort of 7:30 in the morning. No, deserved better slot than that. But I did catch it and I watched it again and I absolutely loved it. Norman Beaton is a genius. So the book is dedicated to Norman Beaton. And there's a little piece about him at the end of the book, just before you get to the huge database of Black theatre productions in Britain from 1825 to 1975. I thank you. I'm more than happy to take questions, so please do write it all down. Deep Other Roots, Stephen Bourne, and I do hope you will find the book and will find it as interesting and as fascinating as I had found researching and writing it. I got there in the end.
All right, Stephen, where can one buy your book, Deep Are the Roots by Stephen Bourne?
You can already pre-order on Amazon. It's on Amazon. And from the 7th of October, please, as I said to you at the beginning, pester your bookshops. Keep your bookshops alive and order it from your bookshop. Right, that's why I said write it down so you won't forget.
Are you going to have a book launch for the book itself in October or November?
Nobody has any money, Tony. Nobody has any money. Nobody wants to do a book launch.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. I've tried about 3 different venues, all of whom have said no, including the National Theatre.
What?
No, it's people want money. People are recovering from lockdown and COVID and they don't have any money. My publisher doesn't have the money to pay for a book launch. I mean, it's not a big publishing house. It's not like some of the publishing houses. So, but no, I'm doing what I can. There's going to be an interview at Hatchard's in Piccadilly. I've never been there. Hatchard's bookshop in Piccadilly. I think it's the 27th of October.
Right, what do you need for a book launch, Stephen? Do you just need a venue? Is that what it is?
It's more complicated than that. For me, Tony, it's to answer your question, it's much easier to do a book launch at a venue that has a book shop. Right. If you do a book launch at a venue that doesn't have a bookshop, it's more complicated to get the books in. I can't cope with 100 copies of my book. So I went to the National Theatre because I had given a talk on the history of Black women in British theatre a couple of years ago, but they're not up and running, they said. They could have, I'm sure they could have done it, but they said no, because they've got a bookshop. And I thought, because then they can just send everyone out to buy the book and I'll hang around to sign them if people want me to. It's much more complicated than people think, unless you're a celebrity, unless you're famous, and it's all done for you.
All right, we'll leave it with us and we'll see what we can do between our various resources. Apart from that, you mentioned that Carmen Monroe was in Amen Corner of James Baldwin. Do you know what theatre that was in?
Yes, I believe it was actually on that. Let me just check. It was right at the beginning, wasn't it? Sorry. Was it the Aldridge Theatre? Bear with me, I'll have to look at my database. I don't have a copy myself yet. It's still being printed, but they promised me copies.
Someone says it was a tricycle.
In my database, because my database ends before 1987. You'll have to look it up.
Sandra says it was the Tricycle Theatre, Sandra Eargard.
No, it wasn't tricycle. It wasn't tricycle. No, she did Raisin in the Sun and Trouble in Mind. It might have been at the Tricycle, but it did, maybe it transferred, but it was a West End theatre, a big West End theatre that Carmen they did the Amen Corner, because James Baldwin came over and supported them, and there was this wonderful interview with Carmen and James Baldwin on the brilliant Mavis Nicholson afternoon programme, which I bet you can check out on YouTube. I'm nearly there. Carmen. Shaftesbury Avenue, Lyric Theatre, Shaftesbury Avenue. That's where I went to see it, and I caught Carmen matinee, between the matinee and evening performance in her dressing room. That was the first time we ever met. And at the end of the interview, because I was interviewing her for Plays and Players magazine, she said to me, "You know more about my career than I do." And we just burst out laughing. But the very important thing that Carmen taught me was that it wasn't all about racism. The story isn't all about racism. What she impressed on me, as many others did, actors particularly, that there were things that they did, particularly in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, that they were proud of. They were enormously proud of some of the opportunities they had, like when Thomas Baptiste and Isabel Lucas, two very dear friends of mine, did Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf at the Connaught Theatre in Worthing in 1968. Two black actors playing the roles that Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton had just played in the film. I mean, this was integrated casting. I don't think it's ever been done in America. It might have been done by now, but then this was unheard of. And they were proud of that. Isabel and Tommy were hugely proud of that production. And this is what drove me to write the book, to make sure, even if I don't talk in depth about all these productions, at least I flagged them up.
Yeah. You mentioned there was a theatre museum in Covent Garden. Where is that theatre museum now?
It's part of the Victoria and Albert Museum. The Victoria and Albert Museum, I think they took it over.
Right.
And it says the archive. I did go there a couple of times, but I can't even remember. It's in West London somewhere. It's a bit of a trek. The Covent Garden, when it was at Covent Garden, it was much easier for me to get to, much easier for a lot of people to get to. But it's like the British Library. You have to kind of cope with the red tape. Book in advance, get a slot, let them know what you want to look at. But it's a fantastic archive, as is the Black Cultural Archive in Brixton, which also has some theatre.
Yeah. Alda Teresioni says, unfortunately, the archive moved to Blythe House in West London.
Blythe House. She's right. Hello, Alda. Haven't seen or heard from you in years. Yes, that's it. I was right, West London, because I remember standing on some station platform for ages, waiting for the train, but I got there. Blythe House.
How long did it take you to write this book?
8 months. As soon as I got the contract in August last year and signed it, it took me until I had a February deadline. Like everybody else, I was in lockdown. I couldn't visit any archive or library to do additional research. But because I'd amassed a huge amount of material, which kind of scared me a bit, because when I started to formally structure the book and write the chapters, the wealth of material that I'd accumulated without even thinking, returning to it was overwhelming, but fascinating, and finding stuff that I'd collected over time, which is why I focus very much on the early formative years of Black theatre, not the more contemporary stuff, because I haven't really done that depth of research. That's somebody else to do for another book post 1975.
Oh, Adam says Blythe House is now closing and moving to the V&A collection to a new venue in East London Olympic site.
That's what they told me, but that was before COVID, so he's probably right. It's still probably on the cards. So East London, everyone's going to East London because City Hall's going to East London. So good for East London. I might move there if all these important archives are going there. Nah, I'm not going.
When it comes to Edric Connor, does Edric Connor have a blue plaque or a statue or something to recognize?
I wish he was better known. I will say something in Patrick Vernon and oh God,
Angelina Osborne.
Angelina Osborne's 100 Black Britons.
Yeah.
He's in there. So he has got, for the first time, I think, some formal recognition without me being involved. But no, very difficult. He doesn't even have, I mean, he made many recordings. He made albums in the 1950s of songs of Jamaica, songs of Trinidad. None of them are available on CDs. Hardly any of his recording output is available on CD. He's so overlooked, and it broke Pearl's heart that he's so poorly remembered in this country as a trailblazer, as a pioneer, not just in the arts, but politically as well. I mean, he worked tremendously hard, but yes, we need to be better at honouring Edric Connor with an English Heritage Blue plaque or any sort of plaque.
If there was a blue plaque or memorial in honour of Edric Connor, where would you suggest it go?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that one, but certainly their former home in Crediton Hill in Hampstead, I think it is, in North London, is the place where Edric and Pearl in the 1950s would invite the newcomers to this country, the arts people that would gravitate to them for help and advice. And they would have open house, they would give them food, they would give them a bed for the night. So it sounds like that home, I've got the address written down, would be perfect.
Is there a link between Edric Connor and Harry Belafonte with regard to calypso and singing?
Well, the way I understand it, and I could be corrected on this, a lot of the genuine calypsonians, I don't know whether Edric ever got involved in it, but some of the Trinidadian calypsonians of the early period didn't appreciate Harry Belafonte, who was from the Caribbean. He was, I think, born in Jamaica. Yeah, was raised in America, was sort of this African American appropriating their music. But I suppose really, when you look at it, I can understand their sense of frustration. I don't think Edric had a problem with it because, I mean, he even made a record. He was a big football fan and his football team was Manchester. And he made a very famous record, which still gets played occasionally on BBC, Manchester United Calypso. Manchester, he had a deep voice like Paul Robeson. But his, as I say, his recording output, almost nothing is available on CD.
A question about Una Marson. Una Marson, I think, had done a play called Porcomania. Is that something you're familiar with? Porcomania by Una Marson? Yes,
not I believe in London. She did At What a Price in London in 1933-34 with an all-black cast of amateur actors, not professional black actors. Porcomania and London Calling, as far as I know, were later in the 1930s, and they were produced at Jamaica's Ward Theatre. But I haven't included Una Marson in this first edition because I'd already written about her in at least 3 of my books, previous books, including Under Fire and Mother Country. So what I've said to my editor at the History Press is he suggested that when we do a paperback version later on, if the hardback is successful enough, then I can revise it and include, and I want to include Una Marson's drama output in the new version. Well, it's not a new version, it's the same book, but with some additional material.
So apart from being a kind of a civil rights activist, Una Marson and radio broadcaster, Una Marson was also a playwright in her own
Yes, she was. And those were the 3 key plays that she did: At What a Price, Porcomania and London Calling, all in the 1930s. And yes.
You got some information.
She was the first, as far as I'm aware, the first black woman to have her play produced in this country. I don't think there's another one in my database until Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun in 1959 in the West End. And then in the 1960s, there was Adrian Kennedy, Funny House of a Negro, another African-American playwright whose work was imported to this country. Very, very few Black women playwrights.
And Mr. Bourne, speaking of Una Marston, didn't you have something to do with a plaque in her honor in Southwark? Wasn't that you?
Oh yeah. She has a Southwark Heritage blue plaque, not Southwark Council, Southwark Heritage blue plaque outside her former home in Brunswick Park in Camberwell, SE5. I have done a lot of promotion of her in South London. I'm going into a primary school next week for Black History Month to talk about her and Dr. Harold Moody and other local Black figures. I don't want to give too much away about where I live, but I'm at South Londoner.
Someone says some information here. I think it's Adam says, Ira Aldridge's bust has been moved and now is in the most impressive location at the Grand Salon, Drury Lane Theatre Royal. Beautiful bronze and pattern reproduction painting. Oh, so it's in, it says here, painting very top of the stairs, FOH at Old Vic. So there's two things there, Ben.
Yeah.
Then there's Drury. Yeah, I think there's a bust in
Drury Lane.
Yeah, that's what he's saying here.
Well, that's good to know. I didn't know that. Thank you for that. I mean, I'm learning all the time. But I didn't know that Drury Lane had recognised Ira Aldridge as well. That's good to know. I'll do a bit of investigating about that. But I was at the unveiling. Earl Cameron, the actor, did the unveiling at the Old Vic in 2004. It was Oku Ekpenyon, who was a colleague in the Black and Asian Studies Association, that campaigned to get that recognition at the Old Vic.
Yeah, and I think that she was able to kind of get the National Portrait Gallery to donate their Ira Aldridge to Amazing Feat all by itself.
Yeah, it's the picture that I showed you of Ira Aldridge as Aaron the Moor in Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus. 1852, that portrait was taken. So that's the picture in the Old Vic.
Alicia would like to know, is your book available in the United States of America?
Oh, I don't know. I hope so. I hope Americans will find it and purchase it. On Amazon, I would imagine, if you look on Amazon, amazon.com, I'll ask the History Press about that, because I think this is a book that would have a lot of interest for people in America that are interested in Black theatre anyway. So fingers crossed. But it's up to Americans to push and say to their bookshops, I want you to import this book.
Question from Sandra, does your book mention Tallowa, Black Theatre Co-op, or Temba?
No, because I finished in 1975, but they didn't exist then. Temba might have. I might have mentioned Temba, but I do mention them in the introduction chapter, which I haven't talked about tonight. My introduction chapter takes you back. As I said, it's semi-autobiographical. So the book begins in 1981. I'm working at the Peckham Dole office. Lots of unemployed people at the time of the New Cross fire, followed by the Brixton uprising, and it hit Peckham as well to a lesser extent. And so what I talk about is how it impacted on me, how it impacted on the wider community in South London, and how out of that traumatic experience for the Black community, especially in 1981, 40 years ago, funding started to come through for Black theatre companies. So I do mention some of the Black theatre companies that I went to see the plays of. Black Theatre Cooperative, I remember going to see some of their plays. It's all in the book. It's not about that. The book isn't really about contemporary or those production. I'm focusing more on the pioneering, trailblazing companies that came before then.
So Jackie says on that point, do you plan to do a sequel? It's going to be a part 2 from 75 to 2021. Is that something you're thinking about?
No plans at all, because the depth of research, the honest answer is that the depth of research that I've done from 1825 to 1975 is incredible. I mean, as I say, I'm not being arrogant. I just amazed myself when I went into my cabinets and discovered how much I had done, but I hadn't kept it up to date. It's impossible. And I think the story becomes a different kind of story. I think it's really a much broader canvas, a much more complex story than this 1975, pre-1975 story. And I really, really hope that my book will be the foundation for a sequel to be written by somebody else that is more engaged with the last 46 years, well, 50, almost 50 years. So there is a book there to be done, but I wouldn't attempt it because I'm getting too old, and it would take years to research it. It really would. But it needs to be done in an accessible way. I have to emphasize this. Please, there's plenty of academic books. There's plenty of PhDs being published. Lovely. I mean, good luck to people if they get doctorates and get titles after their name. That hasn't been my approach. I want to write books that are well researched, thoroughly researched and sourced so that people can go off and find other sources and information, but are accessible to a wide, and that's what I've been doing for 30 years.
You mentioned that previously you had issues with publishers taking your work seriously because they looked at Black people and Black history. Have you found that since 2020 and the various changes that you've now been swamped with offers and interest and updates?
No. Well, ironically, just after I agreed with the History Press to do this book last summer, I was contacted out of the blue by one of the publishers that turned this book down earlier on. He didn't know, he wasn't working there then. I didn't mention it to him. And he was insisting that I sign a contract with them, that I write another Black history book for them, and they will pay me more money. And I said, no, I'm loyal to the History Press. They may not pay me much, but I trust them and I trust their judgment. You should have come to me 20 years ago. I said, but when I finish this book, I may come back to you if I have another idea. We'll see. But it was kind of irony. But no. I can't even get a literary agent. I've given up trying to get a literary. You see, the thing people have to understand, and I mean, I'm sure most of the people signed in tonight will understand this. Publishers are very white and very middle class. Literary agents are very white and very middle class. You can count on one hand how many Black publishers there are in this country. You can count on the other hand how many Black literary agents there are. And so that needs to change. The white middle classes ain't going nowhere. They ain't giving up their jobs to anyone. They're paid well. Sometimes they publish fascinating books. And they are beginning to commission more Black writers, which is absolutely brilliant, because there is, I think, coming up in the next couple of months, a lot of Black interest books. I've just read David Harewood's fantastic memoir. And so that is not going to change. All we can hope for is that the mindsets of these people changed, and that they commission more Black interest books and focus more on Black writers as well. I mean, that would be good, but not to forget those of us that have been doing this work for a very long time. I've got another book pipeline, so I'm okay for another year or so.
All right, so what can we do as individuals with our little social media or contacts? What can each person do on this online?
Spread the word about the book, please. I ain't going to rely on The Guardian or The Telegraph. The Guardian have never acknowledged any of my Black British history books. Wow. It's something that really upsets me even to this day. And that's nothing to do with me. It's to do with the subject matter of my book. So I'm going back over 30 years. So there's still a lot of changes to happen, but I do, to pick up on what you've just said, I know you were talking to the participants, but I do urge people, if they feel the inclination, to spread the word about this book. It's so important. Not for my bank balance, I'm not going to make much money out of it. It's not that. It's the people in the book that are important. Their stories need to be heard. Edric Connor, Carmen Monroe, there's a whole list. L. John, Alfred Fagon. There's so many people in the book that their stories need to be heard and they need to be recognised. So spread the word, if not for me, then for them.
You got a few comments here. So Nubian Ingis is going to do a review. Bernadette is going to spread the word on her social media platforms and also in her reading group. Adam says, contact Society of Theatre Research, Stephen, as we have lectures and reviews books. Contact Society of Theatre Research. I never heard those guys. So Society of Theatre Research says, Adam says, get in touch with them as they lecture and do reviews of books. So
do they? I didn't know that.
I've never even heard of them. Society of Theatre Research is what it says here.
Society for Theatre Research. No, I mean, they gave me a tiny grant back in 1999 for this subject, but I didn't talks.
And of course, you can always tweet and Facebook and YouTube and TikTok.
I can't do tweet. I don't get tweet.
Well, you can't, but I'm sure people on this format have access to tweet. Oh, Bernadette says, I've also played Edric Connors on my music radio show. That's nice. Yeah.
Oh, please. He's a wonderful, wonderful singer. If you can find his music, then play it, please. We need to...
And Stephen, doesn't Edric Connor have a book called, is it Horizons or something?
Yes. Yes, that was meant 2007. I mean, 1968 he died, but it took until 2007 for his unpublished memoir to be rediscovered and published. I think it was published by the University of West Indies because Pam is still alive, and she told me all about it.
Yeah.
And it's his story in his own words. It's a lovely book. I've got a copy. Yeah, Edric Connor. It's acknowledged in my book, so there's a bibliography with all these references.
Wonderful. All right, so I think we kind of come to the natural end of this conversation interview.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So for the people in the audience, you got about 5 minutes to say goodbye, thank you, etc. before we switch off the stream. And I'd like to say thank you to our guests, Stephen Bourne.
Can I just say very quickly, Tony, that I'm looking at some of the comments. I haven't had a chance because I've been chatting, but I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming and for saying such nice things. Thank you, great presentation. Well, thank you for attending it. I'm just sharing my knowledge, but thank you for those lovely comments. I wish you could print them out and send them to me, but I don't think that's possible, is it?
I can do that. No, it's possible. I can get that.
If you can, because it's nice to read what people have said. It says 99 plus on my chat, so there's a lot of comments.
There are a whole bunch of them. And maybe somebody owns a bookshop in this group. You never know what could happen. People are in New York. Yeah, someone's in New York watching, someone's in Canada. I think someone's in Malaysia.
Wow, that's amazing. So I bet they've never heard of me.
Well,
I've never heard of me. I've never read about me in The Guardian.
Well, don't forget, this will be recorded and put into our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel has about 16,000 subscribers. So that'll get out there to some extent.
And when does it go live on YouTube?
Give it a couple. So within the week, it'll be up there.
Thank you, because my publisher couldn't make it, but they said to send them the link. I will send them the link. But thanks again, Tony. Your support is really appreciated.
No problem at all. All right. Oh, hang on. Someone says I sell books. Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll copy that into your email, and you get all the links. And Michael says, thanks for that, Stephen. Very much enjoyed you sharing your experiences.
Cool. I think I know who Michael is.
I think I do.
Michael for joining us. I saw his name in the I was being nosy.
All right, that's it for now. So this message will self-destruct in 60 seconds. Goodbye in 1 minute.
Thank you. Take care.